How are all the up north people doing tonight? It is so good to see you. And I feel like I hardly need to say what a huge moment this is to meet you, Nina. This is definitely a bucket list for me tonight, if you don't mind me fangirling just a little bit. And hello to everybody who's watching at home. We're so glad that you all could be here with us, if only in the virtual sense. The book, as you probably know by now, is called Dinners with Ruth, and it, of course, concerns Nina and her dear friend, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't think I'm going to be able to just call her Ruth, no matter how many times you do it.
And you shouldn't.
Right. Right. So just putting that out there right now. It is about many other things. It is about female friendship. It is about professional friendships. It is about friendships under one of the hottest magnifying glasses that you can imagine. And it is a really remarkable history of the modern era of journalism and in the Supreme Court and all the political circles that encompass court business. Nina, thank you so much for the book. I thought I knew some things, but I learned so much. I did want to say one thing before we start, just real quick. You've probably heard discussions about what happens when reporters are good friends with Supreme Court justices, even with friendships that precede the justices joining the court by 20 years. I just wanted to say for my part that everyone who is in our line of work reckons with these questions in some way or another. And I think that there is a relevance for every woman who reckons with these questions professionally. And personally, my feeling is there's not one way to handle it. I would just ask you to take a listen, read the book, and see what you think. I know what it's like to move away from friends who have gone hard into politics, women who planned my wedding, women who I was in their weddings, families we vacationed with. And, we all make choices, but I just encourage you to receive the information in this book as it is generously offered. Sorry about all that talk up, Nina. There's so much, you say in the introduction that your husband sort of talked you into this, or maybe it's in the dedication. How did the subject of putting all this on paper come up for you?
Well, Simon & Schuster, the publisher of the book, one of their top agents called me, and I said I wasn't interested. And I kept saying I wasn't interested. And I've said that for years, well before Ruth died, when people were just interested in me writing something about the court. And I was not interested in writing a book. I have a day job. It's not the easiest job in the world, and it's not dangerous. I mean, I did that when I was younger. But it's a lot of, if you could see my desk, it's a disaster area. And so I just kept saying no. And finally, Mindy Marquez, who ended up being my editor and who was the person who first called me, said, would I be willing to talk to the CEO of Simon & Schuster? And I actually heard Cokie Roberts in my ear saying, it would be churlish to say no to something like that. So you should at least have the conversation. So we arranged a Zoom meeting, and he actually came up with the idea for how to frame the book in terms of a book about particularly female friendships, but a memoir that could be couched in terms of friendships and relationships. And obviously also my relationship with Justice Ginsburg. And I could at least, the idea of a memoir, I actually checked to see how many stories I had done at NPR, and it's over 9,000. So just going through 9,000 stories would have been to try to jog my memory, which at this point in my life I might not remember what I did last week. So I that was not possible, but he at least had an idea that I thought was doable, but not while I kept my day job. And I just didn't see how I could do this. And he said, "We will make it easy for you. We'll give you some help, some research help, some, anything you want. We won't give you a deadline. P.S." They gave me a deadline as soon as I signed the contract, or at least asked me. And I was still sitting there saying he was dealing with every one of my objections. And then I went to my ace in the hole. And at this point, my husband had wandered into the room and I had said, "Sit down and listen to this." And my ace in the hole is that he really did not want me to write a book. He no longer is an operating surgeon. He was a trauma surgeon. He still does a lot of quality work and a lot of administrative work, and he teaches a lot, but he doesn't operate anymore. So he doesn't have quite the insaner schedule than I had, where he would work 30 hours in one stretch commonly. And then when he turned 70, he stopped operating. And so he was very clear about the fact he did not want me to write a book because he didn't like sharing my time any more than he already does. And so I literally had my mouth open to say that, and that was my ace in the hole. And he'd been listening to this whole back and forth, and he said to me, "I think you ought to write this book." And I thought, crap, you were my ultimate excuse. Nobody could argue with that. Nobody could say, "We'll give you a researcher." Nobody could say, "We won't give you a deadline." They couldn't say, "Oh, it'll be fine with your husband," because it wouldn't be fine with my husband. And then suddenly it was fine with my husband. So the dedication in the book says, and I think it's an accurate description. It says, "To my husband, David, who put up with all the late nights of writing this book and then apologized for talking me into it." And I think that's an accurate summary of what happened.
Nice. I have just a few questions about the life that happened before we knew you as covering the court. People may know that Nina's dad was a very renowned concert violinist and a child prodigy when he was growing up in Europe. And he is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was a survivor of the Holocaust, and your mother, it felt from reading the book as though the fact that almost his entire family died, it felt like it might have had a formative effect on the environment that they built for you while you were growing up. Do you think that was the case?
I'm sorry, but you're breaking up. So
sorry.
I need you to say what you were saying again.
Sure.
Just the question part. I got the run up to the question, but the question.
Okay. How did your father's childhood experiences, do you think that informed the life that he wanted for you?
I don't know whether nobody in my family was a journalist, God knows. But I have two sisters. We're three girls, women, and three daughters. And I think that, we all came of age in an era when every place we worked, for the most part, for a very long time, we were either the only woman or one of two women. And we are all, I'm the most, I suppose, in a larger sense, the most famous of the three of us. But one of my sisters is a federal judge, and the other one has her own business in New York City. So these are they are hardly chopped liver. And in fact, I would say that they both do their jobs incredibly well and work incredibly hard. And I think probably the model of my father as the consummate professional was something that had some influence on us. And the fact that he never, ever suggested to us that we couldn't do what we wanted to do. He didn't affirmatively say, go out and go get them. He just was never one of those parents who said, well, you're a girl, you can't do that. And when we were coming of age, that was a pretty rare person.
You will learn as you read the book of how Nina went to school at Boston University for a couple of years and then entered the workforce instead of taking the degree. And as she started working in newspapers, rescued herself from the horrors of the women's page, and through a lot of work and extra assignment shifts, ended up in a job with the National Observer. And somebody knows who that paper is. Yeah. We just had a gasp from the audience. Tell us about how you got editors to give you more serious assignments at a time when there were not a lot of women, if any, in the newsrooms you worked in.
Well, I mean, they did hire me. I mean, I may have been the only one, but they hired me. And so, and I worked very hard, and I was very feisty, and I was absolutely, I can't honestly say I was fearless, because there was plenty of internal angst, but to the world, I was fearless. The persona I put out there was fearless, because I understood that was the only way anybody would let me succeed. I just had to work. I mean, I don't work as hard as I worked when I was in my 20s and 30s and even 40s. I worked easily 12-hour days and routinely. And now I work more often 10-hour days, and sometimes 8 or 6-hour days if I you know, I'm just like every other person. I'm perfectly good at procrastinating when the time comes. So I just wasn't going to accept the fact that there were so few of us in the workforce then. And then when I walked in the door of NPR, of course, most of the reporters were women. And the simple fact was that no man would have worked for what they paid us back then. And so that's how we all got our jobs and made our bones, so to speak, at NPR, because we at least had a chance. We weren't paid much, but we at least had a chance.
Yeah. You talk about the fact that there was, there were sexist comments, which cannot come as a surprise to anyone who remembers that era, and that there were more aggressive forms of harassment, stories from the National Republican nominating, or I'm sorry, was it the New Hampshire primary or the National Republican Nominating Convention? Nixon versus Romney? It sounds like that was a pretty hostile work environment, to say the least.
Well, it just sort of was the way it was. I mean, women of our generation had no choice but to suck it up. And then as we moved up, we enabled others to not have to suck it up. That was our job, to make sure that they didn't have to face what we faced. And it was hardly subtle. I mean, I used to walk down the hall at work to the place where you could there was a coin machines where you could get lunch. And some of the men I worked with in the print shop, who I had a very nice relationship with when I was in the print shop, would line the corridors and just dissect my physical being. And I just learned to stick my nose in the air and keep walking. And the same was true in the House of Representatives, where members of Congress would sit on the benches just outside the actual chamber and catcall me. Like I said, it wasn't so.
Yeah. Just one more note, and I'm very reluctant to spoil the stories of the book, but I just have to note that as you started working on issues related to the Department of Justice, you made an enemy of J. Edgar Hoover. And it's notable that as a reporter, to find out that J. Edgar Hoover opened an FBI file on you. It's notable to learn much later that he had written a note to a staffer saying, well, she certainly is a persistent bitch. What
It was my third or fourth request for an interview, because I was assigned to do a profile of him when I worked for the National Observer. And they gave me a month to do it, and I interviewed a lot of people. But apparently they ran my note asking for an interview, which was, I said, I've done it. I had sent several before this. He wrote across it, she certainly is a persistent bitch, but I don't have it, because even though I got most of my file and was shown that particular note, that part I never got. If I had that, it would be framed in this office. Because that's the definition of good reporting.
I mean,
maybe not the bitch part, but the persistent part.
Some people would be putting that on their business cards, on stationery. I mean, yeah. Will you tell us what Supreme Court news and Supreme Court reporting was like when you first took on assignments covering the court?
I'm sorry you broke up.
I'm sorry too.
What was like?
What Supreme Court news was like, the kind of stories that people could read. What was the news like coming out of the courts? Was it very readable?
It was a more staid time. But there were some very good reporters covering the court. I mean, I would be happy to achieve to be as smart and as quick as Anthony Lewis from the New York Times, or Lyle Denniston, who worked for the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Star were. They were fabulous reporters. And I'm not sure that any of us covering the court today is as good at covering the actual substance of what the court does as they were, and as fast. They were fabulous.
You did not have legal training?
No, I did not. And in the beginning, I really didn't know what I was doing at all, which is how I first met then lawyer Ginsburg, who had filed her first brief in the Supreme Court when I called her up. She was a professor at Rutgers Law School, and I called her up to explain the brief to me, and because I didn't understand it. And that was the beginning of my getting to know her, which ultimately turned into first a professional friendship and then a personal friendship.
And again, this was 22 years before she was nominated to the Supreme Court. She was at first this very, very respected and brainy law professor, and then later a federal judge. What was she like before she became the icon that the world now knows as Justice Ginsburg?
Well, she was if she was talking about her work, she was always willing to help me understand something. And she was she worked often 24 hours and straight to get everything done that she was getting done. And she had 2 children. But she was very shy, very, very shy. And she remained that way for the rest of her life. I mean, she really did enjoy her iconic status in her octogenarian iconic status. She found it really remarkable and fun. and I think she thoroughly enjoyed it. And she was a great performer on stage, or when she was making a legal argument, or when she was asked to come talk to President Clinton for a possible nomination to the Supreme Court. And he fell for her hook, line, and sinker and offered her the job that night. She knew how to perform, but at a dinner table, it could be work sitting next to Ruth because she was very shy and quite quiet.
Why was she an important friend for you?
I think that even though she was more than a decade older than I, we were essentially coming of age and coming into some professional prominence at a time when we both felt, even though she was far more accomplished than I when I first met her, and forever actually, but we were very much outsiders looking in. And I think, both felt very much like we had our noses pressed up against the window, and there were all these guys doing all this work, and we were saying, let us in. We can do that work too. We can do it as well as you do, and maybe sometimes better.
You just got some amens from the crowd here. Did you two ever talk about, once she was on her rise toward the court, did you two ever talk about whether you should be friends?
No, because by the time she was on the court, we had been friends for over 2 decades. I'm just counting at 70, 80. Yeah, by the time she was nominated to the court, we'd been friends for over 2 decades. And we certainly understood what the boundaries were. And in fact, when she was nominated to the court, I did not see her during any of that process. I literally stepped away from her because I didn't want to be part of her cheering section. That would not be appropriate for me. And at the end of her life, there's a story I tell in the book, and I said it, and I told at the time that after she died, she had developed a really close friendship with my husband, David, who was a trauma surgeon who had been chairman of surgery at one of the Partners hospitals in Boston before we got married, came to Washington and was vice chairman of surgery at probably the largest local hospital, Fairfax Hospital. And she had developed a friendship with him and a relationship with him that was separate from me, because whenever something went wrong physically with her, she would consult David. And when Marty, her husband, was alive, he would consult David. Not hardly exclusively, but I think he was their I'm looking for the right word, their sounding board, their professional sounding board. So at the end of 2018, when she was diagnosed with lung cancer, my husband David actually organized all of the biopsy and all of that. I didn't know anything about it. She had broken some ribs, and they had seen this mass in her lungs, and she had to have a biopsy. And David then arranged it, was there for it, and all of that. And for the next 6 weeks, unbeknownst to me, he was helping her make decisions about where she would be operated on, and et cetera, and what was going to happen, et cetera. And then he went with her to Sloan Kettering. When we were in New York, he, trained observer that I am, when he said, I've got to go talk to Ruth about something, I just never imagined that there was something serious going on. And then when the court announced that she had been operated on for lung cancer, and he'd given me the heads up a few hours beforehand, and I just waited for the press release, and then I did my thing. And that night I was sitting with him in a little restaurant waiting to do a TV hit, and we were grabbing a bite, and the phone rang. She'd been operated on just hours before, and it was Ruth. And she said, Nina, I'm calling you. I'm sitting here having a better consommé than you have any right to expect in a hospital. She was still in the ICU. As I said, she'd been operated on hours before, and David said she had a chest tube in. And she said, and I'm sitting up, but I'm calling you because I wanted you to know why I forbid David to tell you anything about what was going on. I didn't want you to be trapped between your friendship for me and your obligations as a journalist. And it was the most wonderful testament to friendship, actually, that she understood what she was doing. And just hours after she'd been operated on, she called me to tell me. Now, David never would have told me. He's a HIPAA Nazi, but I suppose it might have been, I might have found out in some way, and she was very determined that I not find out.
Were you angry with her? I'm sorry.
No,
You
no.
were not. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
She was protecting me and protecting herself. That's a very good combination.
This book is the story of many other friendships, not just with women, but with some women that I know you know, Cokie Roberts, Linda Wertheimer, Susan Stamberg, and the very large and very strong network of women who worked at NPR back in the early years. Everyone was so different in the group, and yet you had common experiences in journalism. What was it like to fall in with a group of women who really understood what you had been through?
It was really great because we were exactly the same age. We were experiencing the same things at the same time. And we became really close friends. We went to the movies together on Saturday nights with our husbands. And we did tons of things together. And when my late husband fell on the ice and had a terrible head injury, Cokie and Linda in particular just saw me through the next 5 years. They and my sisters, they were my radio sisters, and my sisters were my sisters. And among them, they got me through day after day after day of a really hard time of taking care of my husband before he died. And they were incredible. Thank God I had some ability to pay that back to Cokie. And the one time, Cokie did amazing things for me. I was away. My husband was in the hospital for about 9 months. And this is after his head injury. He then was operated on for lung cancer, and they got rid of the cancer, but he was so frail that he was in the intensive care unit for about 6 or 7 months, and another couple of months in the step down unit until they finally let him go. But there was a time when he was really, I was away. It was after the Oklahoma City bombing, and I went to Oklahoma to do a story about the legal teams for Nightline and NPR, because at the time I did special things for Nightline to make some more money because NPR paid so little money. I had to get more money. So, and I got back from being out during the day, and I called the ICU just to check in, and the nurse said to me, Nina, most people have 9 lives. Your husband has had 27, but I'm not sure he's going to make it to the 28th. And I called the Nightline folks, who actually sent a plane for me the next morning so that I could go back. And when I got to the ICU, who was sitting there with Floyd? Cokie. She was sitting there to make sure that he knew that I was coming, and that and he rallied and survived.
I'm fascinated with stories of the office culture of that period. Will you please explain for our guests the fallopian jungle?
So Cokie, Linda, and I sat together in an area not that much different from the one I'm sitting in now. We didn't have, and I still don't have, an office. I have an area. So we sat together. Cokie's desk and mine abutted each other, and Linda sat off to the left. And the guys referred to that, and then we had a ratty old couch that we had commissioned from some other place. And when younger women had problems, they would come and sit on our couch, and we would try to work them out. And the guys referred to our corner as the fallopian jungle, which I think we actually thought was high praise.
What were the ways that the group supported you as a journalist?
You broke up.
Sorry.
You're breaking up more again. So sorry. What did you say?
How did these women support you as a journalist?
How did
Cokie and Linda and Susan, how did they support you as a journalist?
Well, we were all covering a ton of stuff. I mean, remember, this was a time when at first we had only one program, and it was an hour and a half, and it started at 5, not 4. Now we have 3 flagship programs every day, and there's no way anybody can be on all of them, much less file for digital, do podcasts, do social media, all the things that we do. So I covered the Hill a lot. I covered every scandal that came up. I covered all the impeachments that happened until Trump, and I only was a sort of a bit player in the Trump impeachments, but I was the co-anchor for the Clinton impeachment. And so I covered Capitol Hill, I covered the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, and I covered the Supreme Court, and I also covered the intelligence community. Now we have probably 8 people who do that. And we need 8 people to do that, to cover it properly for all of our various platforms. But we were young and feisty and scrambling, and we helped each other. Do you know anybody on this committee? I need to find out X. And Cokie used to, because I was more of an investigative reporter than Cokie or Linda, I think, she used to just howl at some of the things that I was pursuing, because the questions I had to ask people were rather personal. Let's put it that way.
One of the parts of the book that I enjoyed the most, just as a reporter, were things you said about the nomination process for federal judges and for the Supreme Court. And of course, the nomination of Clarence Thomas and the story that you broke that Anita Hill was the person who had accused him of sexual harassment. it's a story you've told many times, but I was surprised. I don't know why I didn't know this, but is it true that Justice Thomas has not granted you an interview since all of that happened?
That who?
Justice Thomas has never,
Well,
has
I
not.
haven't, I mean, Supreme Court justices don't usually grant interviews unless you know them pretty well. I mean, it's pretty hard to get an interview with somebody whose life you've made miserable. And in candor, I don't, I've never asked because I know what the answer would be. And I hope that I will get a chance to interview some of the newer justices at some point, either off the record or on the record. But some of that stems from them trusting you not to be, to them trusting you to ask legitimate questions and not crazy questions.
When you think about the court today, do you think it's possible for us to step back to a place where there's more of a middle?
Well, there is no middle on the court today. And I mean, that's what makes it different, among other things, from all the other courts I've ever covered. And I've been covering the court since 1968, on and off, and not probably as thoroughly as I do now. But there always was a middle, 2 or 3 justices in the middle, and often, depending on the issue, justices would be on a different side than you. They were not entirely predictable. Today, the court is largely because there were 3 Trump nominations and confirmations, and those 3 individuals have moved the court so dramatically to the right that it is now, I think, a court more conservative than any court in almost 100 years. And so, and on the other hand, there are 3 Democratic appointees who are, to one degree or another, I think would be fair to say, quite antagonized by the sort of this conservative bloc. And so the court is there is no middle. The Democratic appointees would be considered sort of, I think, mainstream liberals in the old sense of the term, but the 6 conservative justices, and certainly 5 of them, would have been outliers in any court that I covered up until probably the 2000s. I mean, Justice Thomas certainly has been is the most senior, actually, member of the court, and he's been there since 1991. But now he has 4 other pretty like-minded people, to one degree or another, with the Chief Justice occasionally not agreeing, but though you only need 5 votes to win, and there are 6 conservative justices, very hard-right conservative justices. So if one flakes off, it doesn't matter. What's really interesting, though, is I think that the court is not a very happy place as well, that the conservatives don't agree with each other about what approach to take very often. I don't think they all like each other very much. Justice Alito seems to have gotten angrier the more he prevails, which is a little odd. And the leak of the Dobbs case was symptomatic, I think, of a court that was fracturing in a lot of ways.
Do you know who leaked?
No. And I don't think we'll ever know.
Really?
Not in my lifetime. I mean, nobody knows who were my sources were for the Anita Hill story. And they had a special counsel who investigated that for the Senate. And they subpoenaed my phone records without my knowledge until after it was all done. Leak investigations are very difficult. And most of the time they don't succeed.
There's a lot of good stuff about that in the book. Just saying. Also in the book, you talk about friendships on the court between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Antonin Scalia. They had a very long friendship. And also the respect between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Thomas. They had a working relationship. I think some people hear about those kinds of friendships and they think it means that somehow the justices may think more of their professional relationships than about the case law they're making. They are
well, just because you disagree with somebody doesn't mean you can't be that person's friend. You know? And I guess the Scalia-Ginsburg friendship is emblematic of that. But I've had a lot of friends on the court, including Scalia, who I really had just enormous affection and respect for, and Justice Powell and Justice Brennan, and none of those people are of one ideology. I mean, it's not like my friends on the court, the people who helped me and were open to being at least a professional friend. In Scalia's case, I knew Scalia also well before he was elevated to the Supreme Court. And I was terribly sad when he died. And I think it was a real loss to the court because he was such a happy warrior. And there's nobody like that there now.
You say in the book that you and Justice Ginsburg did not gossip about cases that were before the court. You know, that there were boundaries and not idle conversation that would have come.
If you want to have a friendship or even a professional relationship with a Supreme Court justice or a judge for that matter, or and you say to that, and if I were to say to Justice Ginsburg or Justice Scalia or anybody else, so what happened at the conference this week? They would look at me like I had three heads, and they wouldn't want to actually have a professional relationship with me at all, because that really is not done. You do not ask a judge what's going on behind the scenes. Most judges will talk to you fairly candidly about cases long gone by, but not when it's happening. And that's what makes them really very different from politicians whose MO is get to know journalists, find out what they know, you tell them what you know. It's a sort of everybody's scratching everybody's back, but that's not true with Supreme Court justices. And that's part of what made the Dobbs Leak so extraordinary and so destructive, because it was unlike anything before. And it was, I think most of my colleagues and I think, and most of the folks I know who know a lot about the Supreme Court, think it pretty clearly was aimed at preventing the Chief Justice from getting an additional vote for a more limited opinion in Dobbs that would have not reversed Roe, but would have upheld the Mississippi ban on abortions after 15 weeks. Well, he didn't get a fifth vote. And what is fascinating about the decision is that the Dobbs leak was of a draft that was a first draft, I take it, that was circulated in February. Now, most decisions change quite substantially in their tone, in their language, after not just the first draft, after the 5th or 10th or even 20th draft. But there is hardly a word different from that first February draft. And so I think most of us think that this was a conservative leak. I have no idea who, I just know why. I think I know why. And the why was to freeze the status quo as it was when that first draft was circulated.
The new composition, the temperature on the court right now, this time of tension, has it changed your job?
Has it changed
your job?
Well, I think it's harder to get to know justices in this with this tone going on. And that's difficult for me because I always thought and continue to think that knowing justices beyond just seeing them on the bench enriches my understanding of them, the experiences they've had, what makes them tick, why they are who they are, why their views are their views. And I think that enriches what I'm able to bring to what I write for the radio or on digital, and enriches that thus what our listeners and readers know about the court. And I think that because there is considerable turmoil up there right now, and I've even done some of those stories, it makes it harder to know them and to understand what makes them tick.
That reminds me of a writing question I wanted to ask. You probably know that some of Nina's stories, by necessity, are quite long. You know, when you're trying to help people understand a very important decision, you know, these are some of the longer stories that broadcast on NPR, short of mini documentaries.
They're not that long.
No. I just mean there are many reporters who will just do 3 minutes, 4 minutes like that. It may take a while. They may never do an 8-minute story, but writing a book, how was the process for you?
It's harder than you might think. I think in the end, I did 4 rewrites of it. And some of them were, probably the last one was relatively meager rewrite, but still, and then there's just a ton of stuff that you never thought of that you have to do with the book, from checking everything in it and you can't believe what you've written and not noticed that it was wrong, because you know better. And so on the 3rd rewrite, you go, what? So I wrote that. But the other thing is that almost everything is ultimately up to the author. So even the selection of photographs and then getting the clearances to use those photographs is up to the author, all of which is very painstaking work. I actually hired my niece to do it. She's a professional photographer, and I paid her serious money to do that and to help me pick the photographs because I didn't have either the expertise or the time to do all the photography work. And once I realized I was about, probably 15% down the road, and I thought, if I do this, I can't do my day job. And so I hired her to do that. And then there's all the promotional stuff you do, the interviews you do, whether they're, I just did a week on the West Coast. I mean, it was incredibly gratifying in Portland, Oregon, for the Oregon Historical Society. There were 1,500 people. And at UC Davis, there were 1,800. And in Santa Barbara, something like 1,800. And that's very gratifying, but it's also, I said to my husband, blessedly went with me to be my keeper. And after 4 stops in 5.5 days, he said to me, now you understand why rock bands sometimes turn to drugs. It's very hard work. And I have a perfectly strong ego, but I've never understood how politicians do it, because what they do is very hard work when they're campaigning too, but you have to really need the gratification. And I just wanted for the book to sell well, and it's doing that.
I did wonder if there were things, when you write a book, you're re-examining everything. Were there things about your friendships with Justice Ginsburg or the others that you discovered or rediscovered through this?
No. I mean, I never kept a journal. If I had, I would have had twice as much material. But no. In that last year of her life, she was at our house for, I think, almost 23 straight Saturdays, because it was the only place she could go. I knew her when she was a young advocate. I was there when she had argued her first case. And I was there when she got nominated to the Court of Appeals. When she didn't get a judgeship, first in New York and then got nominated in DC, and when she became a Supreme Court justice. And I knew her in sickness and in health. And so there was nothing, I probably forgot a lot of stuff, but there was nothing new I learned in writing the book. And, to be fair, it's called Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendships. And it's as much about my husband's, my sister's, my NPR sisters, as it is about Ruth. And it's a sort of a way to frame a memoir. So the purpose wasn't to find out more. I have access to her papers if the Library of Congress ever catalogs them so we can get at them, but not her Supreme Court papers. Nobody has access to her Supreme Court papers. I imagine I will learn some stuff if I ever get access to her pre-Supreme Court papers.
What might precipitate that? What might make that possible?
Well, it would have helped in writing the book if I could have had access, but I don't think the court or the library, I don't think the court had any desire to facilitate getting her papers ready for the library. Her staff certainly did, but Ruth was an amazingly organized person, and she had systems in her chambers. So if she wrote me a note, just a thank you note, which she almost always did after dinner or after something, or if she, it would be copied and kept in there And if there were anybody mentioned in her note other than me, or it would have been copied and kept in that person's file. So I'm most curious to see her correspondence with some people, for example, but at the moment I have too much work to, if they said to me tomorrow, well, come on over to the library, it's all available. Because her biographers have access as well, but I don't think that they have any more access than I do at the moment. And until they do, they probably won't finish writing their biography.
Are you still enjoying work?
Yes, but not at the moment, because I'm wrestling with this Google and Twitter case, and it's just driving me up the wall. Every once in a while, you've hit a complicated case that's actually important and is really technical and boring. And I've been working on this for 2 weeks, and I still don't clearly see what I'm going to write, but it's it's a slightly rookie mistake. If I were speaking to a younger me, a much younger me, I would say, Nina, you've over-reported this story. You've taken more time than you need to. Now sit down and come on, write the sucker.
Somebody give this woman a deadline.
Well, it's creeping up on me.
This is one of the other things that's so unique to the work that you do is the calendar. You know, this nothing's happening, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, and then everything happens. Tell us a little bit about what that does to your work life.
Well, it's actually more difficult than it used to be because the court has actually delivered itself of exactly one opinion so far this year. And it has a lot of very important cases in front of it. And they'll probably mainly come down in June. And it's a sort of a classic train wreck in the last 2 or 3 weeks of June. And some things don't get covered because you can't cover everything on the same day. And it's, I think the Chief Justice is well aware of that, but there's only so much you can do. And the justices are no different than anybody else. When the deadline is there, is when it happens very often. And they're working like crazy in the last 2 months of the term. They are no longer hearing cases at that point. They stop at the end of April. And my husband once, we were at some very fancy black tie do, and it was in June. And my husband, it was fairly early on in his Washington tenure. And he said to Chief Justice Roberts, I think it was an opera ball or something. He said, Chief Justice, don't you think you could spread these out a little more? And I remember the chief looked at him and he said, nice to see you, doctor. And
Only a surgeon. Only a surgeon.
yeah.
We have some questions for you from the audience.
Okay.
We're going to bring up the lights a little bit. Now, we tested this earlier, and I think Nina will be able to hear you a little better than she has been able to hear me. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Let's see, where's our... I'm sorry, I can't see terribly well right now. Would you raise your hand if you have a question for Nina Totenberg, please? Yeah, right here.
This is maybe a little off topic, but it came to mind when I was reading your book, and I've thought about it a lot ever since. You write very favorably of Lewis Powell in your book, but numerous sources cite his 1971 memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as the beginning of corporate domination of democracy, and even the loss of the middle class both considered a negative trajectory for this country. How does one reconcile these opposing images? And to your knowledge, was he aware of this opinion, and did he ever regret writing the memo?
I'm
Did you-
sorry, I can't hear your
May
question.
may
It's a
I try
long
to-
and complicated question.
Right.
And I
So-
know, but I didn't hear the beginning or the middle. I just heard sort of a little bit at the beginning and the end.
May I fill you in? It's about Justice Powell. Justice Lewis Powell was a friend, as well as someone who you covered on the court. The question was about a memo that he wrote for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Some scholars see this as the beginning of corporate personhood. Do you know how he felt about that in later years? And
Corporate personhood or corporate personhood?
Yeah.
So, Lewis Powell was the president of the American Bar Association. He was one of the leading lawyers in the country at a time when there were actually there were fewer lawyers. And there's a biography about him by John Jeffries, which is a wonderful biography, because one of the things that it tells you many things about Powell, including the fact that he was a person who thought deeply and changed his mind from time to time. But when he was a lawyer, he was working for the largest corporations in America. That was his job. And so nothing about, he was trying to figure out what was the best way for business, and he was representing business, to get what it wanted. I mean, I don't think for a minute that he would do something unethical, but he represented the Chamber of Commerce interests, and the folks who are members of the Chamber of Commerce and the businesses that make up the Chamber of Commerce. Those were the interests that he represented. And what's interesting to me, having watched his tenure on the court, is not how often he sided with them, which he did very often, but how often he did not.
Say more.
What?
Can you say more?
Well, I can't remember the business cases all that well anymore, but I can tell you, for example, that there was a great deal of concern among liberals about Powell's nomination, because he had given a speech publicly, and had said that he indicated that he thought in matters of national security, there was no need, the president or the executive branch did not need to get a warrant to tap people's phones, for example. And he did make that speech, and he, in fact, voted exactly the opposite way when the question came to him on the court.
What do you think he would have said about Citizens United?
I'm trying to think back to what I know about what he wrote. I think that he would not have thought that a law enacted by Congress that attempted to limit the influence of big money in elections exceeded the power of Congress, which is what this court has said. Now, would he have struck down some portions of it? Perhaps. I mean, Justice Brennan struck down some portions of, wrote the opinion that struck down some portions of an earlier campaign finance law. But for 100 years, there was well, I guess you could accurately say a legal understanding that in the name of limiting the influence of big money and corruption, there could be laws that limited the amounts of money that could be raised, and particularly the amounts that could be raised of what we now today call dark money. That is money that is not to a candidate, but is raised on behalf of a candidate and often in cahoots with the candidate. And so the Supreme Court has now, since Citizens United, made regulations of campaign finances very difficult. And that certainly was not the understanding, I would say, dating back to the time of Teddy Roosevelt.
Thank you. Another question? Ooh, we've got several. I'm going to let the woman with the microphone decide because I see a lot of hands. Okay. Hi.
Hi, there are suggestions to double or triple the size of the Supreme Court, so opinions can't be swayed by such a small number of people. Good idea or not?
Did you catch that?
Yeah, I did. I can only tell you what Justice Ginsburg said, and she said she was opposed to that idea. That's the adding seats to the Supreme Court is the only thing that Congress could do to change the current makeup of the court without passing a constitutional amendment. You would, of course, have to get over a filibuster in the Senate. So that already you'd have to get 60 votes to do that. But even assuming that you could, what is to prevent the other party from the minute they get in power, then adding another 3 seats to the court and another 3 seats? And then the court looks even more like a political institution than it does today. And I would grant you that it looks more political to a lot of folks than it did when there was a center on the court. But there isn't a center on the court, and that has had its repercussions for the court. It's the Chief Justice is correct. The court is not supposed to decide cases the way they think the public wants them decided. The court is supposed to say what the law and the Constitution is and what it means. I think it's lost a lot of its credibility on that score, and you post overturning Roe, and you can certainly see, and some other cases, and you can see that in the public opinion polls. That's not my opinion. All the public opinion polls are incredibly consistent in saying that the court has lost an enormous amount of its credibility, and that is, I think, a very dangerous thing, because there's only one branch of government that's supposed to be sort of a neutral arbiter. And if people don't believe that the arbitration is neutral, they won't follow the law. And that's the sort of heartbeat of a democratic process, is a law-abiding public.
Other questions?
We're going to take a virtual question right
Oh.
now.
We do have a question from someone at home.
Yes. So this question comes from Susan Odgers. What were RGB's thoughts or process for influencing the pool of her possible successors?
So as you all know, the New York Times reported at some point after her death that President Obama had suggested to her in 2013 or 14 that this was the time for her to think about retiring because he thought he could get a replacement through. And she did not take him up on it. And there are some people who think that that she should have done that. And the question I often get is, did she regret it? I can only tell you what I know about her when Obama suggested that, and what I think happened by the time she died. And that is, when he suggested that, remember, there was still a filibuster in the Senate. She was at the top of her game. She was not sick. And she thought that anybody, I think, she virtually said this, anybody who could get through a filibuster process would not be somebody that she thought was a suitable successor. And so she didn't seriously think about leaving then. She thought very clearly, like many, many, many people, that Hillary Clinton would be elected in 2016. And it certainly never occurred to her that Donald Trump would be somebody like Donald Trump, or Donald Trump himself would be nominated by the Republican Party, much less win. And when that happened, I think she felt pretty stuck that she had to suck it up and last it out. And I think it's pretty clear that in the last year of her life, it was pretty clear to me that she did things to herself in order to stay alive that she would never have done otherwise. And she rolled the dice and she lost. She came damn close to getting past the election, but I'm not sure that even that would have made a difference, because the Republicans controlled the Senate until January.
Other questions?
My husband's really fascinated.
I forgot to say one other thing. She definitely she thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she definitely wanted the first woman president to name her successor. That's what she was looking forward to, wrongly. You know, Supreme Court justices, I think to a person, think that they know that they know about politics. They don't. They think they do, but they don't. Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
That's a big one right there. Please.
Yeah, hi. My husband, Matt, is just really fascinated with how the Supreme Court works, and maybe what you could say is sort of some of the mystery behind how it functions. And I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit about that most people wouldn't know, some of the mystery, if you will, in terms of how it operates.
Well, I mean, I can give you a little bit. I can't give you the mystery, because if it were a mystery, I wouldn't know it. But there are a lot of things about the court that people don't know that are fairly basic. You know, how opinions are assigned. The Chief Justice assigns who will write the opinion if he's in the majority. If he's not in the majority, the senior justice in the majority will assign the opinion. Dissents are usually assigned by the senior justice in dissent. That's almost never the Chief Justice, because he's rarely in dissent. I think, you know, that and sometimes more than one person will write a dissent because they have different views. The court, you know, the justices meet usually on Thursdays or Fridays to discuss all the cases they've heard that week. There's nobody in the room except them, nobody. And if they want something from outside, or if a message has to come in from outside, the junior justice mans the door, so to speak, or woman's the door. And Justice Breyer, I think, was the longest junior justice for a very long time, something like 13 years, that the court's composition simply didn't change. It was the same for a very long time. And that made it a very stable place. And the center really was the center. So the center was Justice O'Connor, Justice Kennedy, and often Breyer, and some other, and maybe ultimately somebody else. It was, and that is not the court today.
Can you recommend, in addition to Dinners with Ruth, can you recommend some further reading for people who want to better understand the workings of the court?
Well, Joan Biskupic, who's a very wonderful reporter who's written a number of books about the court, has a book coming out. I'm not sure when. I'm almost done with it. I'm reading The Galleys now. And it's, if you really want as much of a backstairs look as you're going to get, and it's still pretty limited in its own way, I recommend that book. Or she did a biography of Chief Justice Roberts, was her last book, and that too is a very good book.
We should not let everyone go without getting a chance to hear the book that you've written in your own words. Would you read to us a bit before we end tonight?
Yeah, I started doing this about a week ago, and I thought it really ends the evening well. It's at the end of the epilogue, the very long epilogue that I wrote in June, I think, before this was published in September. And after the Dobbs leak and after the court reversed Roe versus Wade, I still wake up many mornings thinking of Ruth and also Cokie, and sometimes Nino and Lewis Powell and Bill Brennan too. I've been so fortunate to have them all and many more as friends. For the ones who were gone, I often wonder what they would have to say about the current state of the world. Yet I'm struck by the fact that no matter their origins or paths in life, all of them shared a common trait: optimism. Today's events at home and abroad would surely test that optimism. But while I think each of them would be realistic about the challenges we face, they would all be determined to persevere. As Ruth often said, my story is hopeful. So I will be too. I'm not hanging up my spurs anytime soon. And as my mother used to tell me, I'll see you on the radio.
Nina Totenberg.
I'm clicking off now so I can go home and let my husband cook dinner for me. Good night, everybody.
Before you all dash, I've got a microphone. Why don't I use it? One last thing I just wanted to say. We will be out in the lobby, just hanging out. It's so nice to be hanging out together. Can I just say, and I drove all the way from Ann Arbor. I want to hang out with you. Before we do that though, would you guys mind, those of you who have books, would you hold them up and we can get a picture to send to Nina to show her we're for real? We're for real in Michigan. This is going to mean a lot to her, I promise. We want to give a big thanks to all of the staff of the National Writers Series, the board, all the volunteers for making this happen. Please don't miss the next NWS event. In honor of Black History Month, it's going to be podcaster Alvin Hall. I'm going to be listening for this one for sure on February 23rd. He's going to be in conversation with my friend, the news director of WDET, Jerome Vaughn. Alvin's book is about driving the green book. You guys have heard of the green book that Black travelers used to use? Right. This is going to be a hot one. And this is February 23rd. I really think you should come in person. I'm going to be stuck watching from home on the stream, but I'll see you there. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. And thanks to everybody at home, too.